I can't understand the I can't understand the antinomies. There we go. Excuse me. I recently had the privilege of reading through the Oxford History of Western Philosophy, edited and partially authored by Anthony Kenny. And in the section on Immanuel Kant, as you might expect, Kant does devote some space to the infamous antinomies. In the antinomies, Kant was intending to show that pure reason is unreliable, at least when it comes to cosmological reflection. What I can't understand, though, is what all the fuss is about. Now, I don't think Kenny himself accepts the antinomies as compelling arguments against pure reason, but Kant apparently felt they were, and that is what I cannot understand. Um, the idea is that you have two statements that are contradictory to one another, but they're both true. So therefore, the fault lies not in the statements, but in reason itself. So let's take a look at each of them in turn and see if they are decisive against pure reason. So starting on page 185, actually 183, starting on page 183, Kenny writes, uh, Kant believed that any attempt by reason to form cosmical concepts, that is to say, notions of the world as a whole, was bound to lead to irresolvable contradiction. To illustrate the illusory tendencies of pure reason, he constructs a set of antinomies. An antinomy is a pair of contrasting arguments which lead to contradictory conclusions, a thesis and an antithesis. The first antinomy, for instance, has as thesis, quote, the world has a beginning in time and is also limited as regards space, unquote, and as antithesis, quote, the world has no beginning and no limits in space. It is infinite as regards both time and space, unquote. The two propositions, the world has a beginning in time and the world has no beginning in time, have had a long history in the works of philosophers. Aristotle thought the second could be proved. Augustine thought the first could be proved. Aquinas thought neither proposition could be proved. And that's not strictly correct, I think. He did say there were no philosophical, um, compelling philosophical arguments for it, but indirectly, I think he would say that you can establish the Bible as God's word, and that tells us uh, so. Indirectly, it can be proven, but not philosophically, in a Thomistic system. Kant now suggests that both propositions could be proved. That does not mean, of course, that two contradictories are both true. It is intended to show that reason has no right to talk at all about the world as a whole. And then skipping down, in all, Kant presents four antinomies. The second concerns simplicity and complexity. The third concerns freedom and causality. The fourth concerns necessity and contingency. In each of the antinomies, the antithesis affirms that a certain series continues forever, and the thesis that the same series comes to a full stop. Thus, first, the series of items next to each other in space and in time comes to an end. That's the thesis. Then the antithesis, it goes on forever. So in other words, space is finite or infinite, time is finite or space is finite and infinite, time is finite and infinite. That's the first antinomy. Second, The series of items which are parts of others comes to an end. Thesis, antithesis goes on forever. So things are potentially infinite or potentially finite when it comes to dividing them up into parts. Third, the series of items caused by another ends in a free, naturally uncaused event or goes on forever. And goes on forever. So that's the thesis and the antithesis. So causation, there's an infinite causal chain, an infinite causal regress, or there is not. Fourth, the series of items contingent upon another goes on forever / ends with an absolutely necessary being. So when we have contingent things based on other contingent things based on other contingent things and so on, it either goes on forever or stops with a necessary being. Alright, so these are the 4 antinomies, and we'll take the first one now and then save the others for subsequent videos. The first antinomy is that space is, on the one hand, finite, time is finite as well. On the other hand, they are infinite. So the modern scientific age, of course, took place after Kant, so we can't fault him for not knowing the things that we know from modern physics and astronomy and so on. But we do know from modern science that there is a certain circumference to the universe. A diameter to the universe. I forget how many light years it is, but it's quite large. But it's not infinitely large. There is a finite distance from one edge to the other. And then beyond that edge, there's, of course, a large wall of never mind. I was trying to be funny, but I dropped it. Alright, so the universe, science tells us, is finite in size. That is the diameter from one end. The diameter across the universe is finitely long. And time has a beginning, according to the Big Bang, and it will have an end in the heat death. So time will essentially stop at that point. Also, according to the Bible, if we are Bible believers, the world began to exist and it will end. Time will be no more, as it says in Revelation. Alright, so we're prepared to buy the first part of that antinomy, the first horn, if you will. The second horn, that they are infinite. Is there any reason to suspect that space and time are infinite in size? Well, without appealing to science, I guess philosophers have argued about that in the ancient world, the Greeks, perhaps, but there really isn't anything that immediately comes to mind to support those. The ones that Kant gives, according to Kinney, it says, in fact, neither of Kant's proofs, quote unquote, is watertight. The argument for the thesis depends on the impossibility of completing an infinite series, etc., etc. The impossibility of a world infinite in space is supposed to fall from the impossibility of infinity in time. I'm out of time, so we'll have to pick up first antinomy in video number 2. Thanks.